What are the Gospels? Some of the most important literature written about one of the most, arguably the most famous person to ever have lived on this earth. And yet there's so much that we assume or don't even know about the Gospels. Well, today we're going to look deep into what the Gospels are, who wrote them, why were they written, what we can learn from them, and observations we can make about them. And hopefully that will start you down a journey of loving the Gospels for what they were meant to be. And so I'm excited today to talk about one of my favorite subjects, the Gospels of Jesus. Let's get into it. Here we go. All right, folks, as we get started, we've got our whiskey poured in our Whiskey in the Writings glass. If you do not have one of these glasses, you need to get one. You can go to storiesoftove.com. I have it linked in our description here of this video, and you can purchase one of your own. And so I encourage you to go pick one up. We are drinking Yellowstone. Once again, this is a favorite of mine. And this is a Kentucky straight bourbon. It's 100 proof, so it's got quite the bite to it, but it is super delicious. It's got a toasty flavor profile to it, and we just really love it here. Whiskey in the Writings, and that's what we're drinking today. So whatever you have to drink, go ahead and make your pour. Let's settle in because we got a big topic to discuss today, the Gospels. All right, folks. This is going to be a conversation that gets a little bit nerdy, and that's okay. So this is a sit back, relax, take it all in, take notes along the way. There might be things in here that you've heard before. There may be a lot maybe you've never heard before, but we're going to unpack what are the Gospels. I find this an interesting conversation because at the time of making this video, there's a current Jordan Peterson series called The Gospels that have been put out where Jordan Peterson sits kind of round table with him at the head, a bunch of scholars and thinkers, and they discuss what the Gospels are, and it gets very Jordan Peter-esque where he gets all philosophical in nature regarding it, and they try to deep dive into what the Gospels are. And so this is my version of that, a lot shorter, and hopefully a little bit more digestible. What are the Gospels? And so we're going to get right into this right out of the gate. We call these writings, these biographies of Jesus, we call them Gospels. The Gospel according to, traditionally how they were labeled, the Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel according to Mark, and so on and so forth, Luke and John. These Gospels, these four that we've collected, are essentially biographies of the life of Jesus. Now, you might be asking right out of the gate, or something you've been wanting to ask and didn't know who to ask, but what about the other Gospels that are not in our New Testament? Okay, so we're going to right out of the gate just address this issue. There are writings that are 2nd, 3rd, 4th century writings called Gospels, and they're attributed to like the Gospel of Mary or the Gospel of Peter or the Gospel of Philip or Thomas, and these figures that are New Testament figures in history, but these writings are not by those people. They are mostly known as what's called Gnostic writings. Gnosticism was a 1st century belief system that the early Christians had to combat in order to preserve the classic Christian tradition that the eyewitnesses were taught. And so Gnosticism was a thing that was being dealt with in and after the time of Jesus. And so these writings begin to emerge by this community of people called the Gnostics. Just Google it; you'll find lots of information about them. And they would attribute the popular names in Christian tradition to their writings for their writings to gain popularity. And so there's a famous gospel called the Gospel of Judas. And I have one of the Gospels. I have a writing. You can get them today. This is the Gospel of Thomas. This writing right here, it's called the Gospel of Thomas. I have it on my library. It's accessible. It's a bunch of sayings that Jesus might have said, or at least according to this writing, said that he said. Here's the thing about this. These writings, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Peter, these sorts of things aren't some hidden surprise thing that it's like, oh my gosh, can you believe that they kept the Gospel of Thomas out of our New Testaments? Why isn't this writing in this writing? And there's good reason for it. And here's the thing. This isn't new information. Okay, this is information that's been around for centuries. In fact, one famous historian, Eusebius, in his work, The Ecclesiastical History of the Church, wrote about what books were being circulated in the 3rd century. And he lists what's called accepted writings, spurious writings, rejected writings. And he's categorizing all the different writings that were being circulated at the time. And he categorizes them as ones that have been accepted and some that are disputable and some that are rejected. And guess what's in the rejected pile, even in the 3rd century? Lo and behold, the Gospel of Thomas. And this, my friends, is before there is an actual canonization of Scripture. Okay, so this isn't like later on and they kept it out. This is like early on in Christian tradition. These kinds of writings were known about and they were easily rejected for different reasons. And we'll get into that here in a little bit. But I'll set that aside. So these things are out there. I've read them. They're not scary. They don't have to be scary. They don't have to threaten anything. They just are what they are, okay? And so just know that those are there. Put that back on my shelf right there. We're talking specifically about the 4 biographies that we find in any New Testament that you pick off the shelf. It's going to have these 4 gospels. The gospels, the biographies, I like to call them biographies rather than gospels. Gospel is a very specific word used for a specific reason. And I like to keep the word gospel for the reason that it was meant to be shared, which is about a kingdom ethic, a kingdom rule and reign that is being inaugurated and launched on the earth through the person and work in life, death, resurrection of Jesus. Excuse me. We'll have to edit that out. So I like to use the word biography because this is what they are at their heart, is biographies. Now, before I go any further, I want to provide a couple resources for you. And I'm going to link to these resources in the show notes so you can go to Amazon, pick them up if you would like. The first one that I'm going to suggest to you is actually this big fatty book right here. This has been one of my favorite purchases in the past few years when it comes to New Testament studies. It is a work called The New Testament in Its World, and it's put together by 2 of the most well-known New Testament theologians of our generation, Mr. N.T. Wright, whom I'm largely indebted to for much of my theological leanings today, and then Michael Bird. And so these 2 theologians put this volume together, and it's just about the New Testament. And it's so gorgeous, and it's so well put together. It's got maps, it's got illustrations, it's got just tons of information for someone who's wanting to learn New Testament studies. And so if this is something that you're interested in and you want to dive deeper into the background, the history, the story of the New Testament, how we got it, where it came from, genres, literary, writings that they are, the archaeological evidence that sits behind them, current questions that exist around the New Testament, this is a book for you. So this is a primary source for me when doing New Testament studies. I do love it. And I'll pull some stuff out of that here in a second. The second source that I'm going to suggest to you is by Michael Bird. Again, he is a part of who wrote this last book that I told you about. But this one is The Gospel of the Lord, and this one is how the early church wrote the story of Jesus. So this is all about the biographies of Jesus specifically, and it really goes into, this is for the nerds in the room, those that are really wanting to dive deep into the Gospels and how these Gospels took shape and became what they are today, this is a must pick up. I'll link to it in our show notes as well. I'll set this one back over here. Thirdly, if you're really looking to get a more commentary study of the New Testament, again, we're talking about the Gospels, but just one that's always been helpful to me. It's on my bookshelf. It's a fatty too, but this work is called the IVP Bible Background Commentary, and this one is the New Testament volume. They also have an Old Testament volume. This one is a second edition. It's put on by Greg Keener. Greg Keener is a professor of New Testament studies at where's Keener at again? My friend goes to that school. Why can't I think of it right now? Asbury University is where Greg Keener is at currently. He got his PhD at Duke, but he's currently teaching New Testament and I think even Old Testament at Asbury. Anyway, if I'm wrong on that, you can look it up and find it yourself. But this acts more like a commentary on all things New Testament, where you can go chapter and verse of what you're looking into and see what the scholar Greg Keener has to say about it, which is always good and helpful and insightful. So that is a fantastic resource for anyone wanting to do New Testament studies as well. Now, we are honing in the Gospels, and I'm going to make some broad overview, informational type observations about each of these four biographies and how they work together and how they're different. And the goal of this is to hopefully get you launched into a desire to understand these works for what they are and how they work together to tell the story of Jesus that we know today. And so let's break down each one independently. No, let's do this. Let's start with how they work together, and then we're going to break down how they work independently, and then we'll come back out of it to see what we can pull out in an observation as a whole, looking at the Gospels. So these Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The order that we have them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, isn't necessarily the historical scholarly consensus as to which ones were written first. The more popular theory on which one was written first, because they're all theories, we don't know. The most popular is the Mark theory, in that Mark was written first. And I'll explain why that is. But the reason why we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John comes out of St. Jerome's ordering in when he put together his New Testament. That's the arrangement he had, because back then they believed that Matthew was written first. And so that was kind of the popular belief back then, that Matthew was written first. And so that's the order that's been kept in our New Testaments, dates back to St. Jerome, and it's just never changed. And it really doesn't need to change, because it doesn't matter a whole lot. Each gospel writer, each biography is trying to do something different in their retelling of their biography of Jesus. Now, the thing to note about these biographies is that a new concept that has been proposed in scholarship is that these writings were written in a certain kind of style. We call them biographies, but they're not biographies through the lens of how we think of a modern biography. And I made a video a while back on what is the gospel, and we looked at Mark and the Gospel of Mark, and I did a whole deep dive into Mark before that, answering that question, which whether that's good or bad, I don't know, but that's what I did. And in it, I talked about how these biographies are called are put into a genre called a Greco-Roman biography. So that's a pretty modern take on what these writings are. And I want to read an excerpt out of the New Testament in Its World by N.T. Wright and Michael Bird. And this is what they say. And I find this very compelling and fascinating. They say this: the Gospels, right, these four Gospels that we have, are similar to Greco-Roman biographies in several material aspects or respects. Number one, they are written in continuous prose. So this is a stylistic way of writing that we see in Greco-Roman biographies. Number two, they present the stylized career of a public leader, which is what happened in Greco-Roman biographies. Number three, they provided a theological framework of his birth, deeds, death, and legacy. Birth, deeds, death, legacy. So these are the frameworks, theological frameworks of every Greco-Roman biography, is how they categorize a person's birth, what they did, their death, and then what came out of that, the legacy after their death. Number four, they are vignettes highlighting his career and achievements. So they feature these vignette moments of like, he did this, and then he did this miraculous thing, and then he did this miraculous thing, and then he said this amazing thing, and he did all these. So these vignettes kind of like, here are this compilation of things that a person does, and you definitely see that in the Gospels. Number five, they have a good deal to say about the manner of his death. So in Greco-Roman biographies, there's this large portion featured on how this person actually died, that mattered. But then also after their death, number six, they exalt their central figure for his virtues while defending him from accusations. And so you see this kind of exaltation of this character in Greco-Roman biographies that are above reproach, kind of a situation. And so we see all of these in Greco-Roman biographies written at the same time that these Gospels would have been written. And that makes perfect sense, because if you think about, for instance, something being written at a time where lots of other genres of writings are being written, you're going to fall in line with how people are reading other things of similar content. And so if you're writing about a character who lived, who died, that you want to get the word out about what this person did, you're going to utilize the method of the time that's being used. Now, to also go as far to say this is that, yes, they do resemble Greco-Roman biographies, and there's a lot of scholarship behind this. There is a lot of Jewish literature undertones mixed in with it. So they are not 100% Greco-Roman biographies. I mean, these people were Jewish, and so they would have had a Jewish influence in their text. But so that's interesting. These are biographies about a person's life, the achievements that they did, their death, and then being exalted as a figure to be followed and to model your life after. And so this is what the gospel writers are doing. So the thing to know about this as well is when you ask the question, why were these produced? Why were these produced? Why did these people take the time to write what they wrote? We'll get into who wrote what, but why did they take the time to do that? And you got to understand that at the time of the movement of Jesus, after Jesus's resurrection, there was a period of time of growth within the church. Luke, who wrote his second part to his biography, the Acts of the Apostles, highlights this reality that the church was growing rapidly. And as the church began to grow, as persecution came into the church, and as false teachings began to emerge. You see this all throughout Paul's writings. Paul is continuously combating false teaching in Corinthians and in Ephesians and Galatians, for sure. He's trying to help correct poor theology that's creeping in. The church had to respond to that, because as eyewitnesses begin to die off, and as the growth of the church begins to scale at a rapid pace, the necessity of the message of Jesus being shared with people that may never come in contact with an eyewitness was growing more and more. And the desire to preserve the life, the teachings, the death and resurrection of Jesus stories was at an all-time high. And so what you see out of this is a writing culture beginning to develop, moving away from what could have been simply an oral tradition. Oral traditions are great when you're living in families that aren't spreading out, right? You live, you die in a certain geographical region. Well, at this time in the known world, the Roman Empire have roads leading everywhere. The world is becoming multicultural. I mean, think of what happened in the technology boom in the early 2000s, where all of a sudden we're being interconnected like we've never been before with people all across the world. Well, that was happening in the first century. For the first time in human history, there was being an interconnectedness of people thanks to the Roman Empire and their ability to conquer and basically destroy lives, but they connected people as well. This was the Pax Romana, the peace that they brought to what they called the world at the time, because it was their world at that time. All that to say, so oral tradition fits fine in communities that are traditionally stationed in one geographical region. But now that this message is in North Africa and it's in the Mediterranean and it's reaching Rome and it's reaching all the four corners of the earth, the known earth at that time, right? There was a necessity to move away from oral tradition and into written tradition. And so the early Christians became a writing tradition movement. They began to move away from the roots of a Jewish culture that was predominantly oral tradition and into a writing tradition that we see emerging in the New Testament. And so the earliest Christians began to use new technologies like codexes to bind together their writings, that they can then share them as they copied them to other communities that they would come in contact with. So this is why these things begin to emerge, and the earliest Christians were at the forefront of that technology, and it's amazing to even think about that they were in the forefront leading the way in technologies versus what we see in many Christian circles today, where we fall shamefully behind the trends versus actually creating the trends. This is what the early Christians did. Okay, so we have these things emerge. Who's writing them then? That's the question. Who's writing them? Well, there's a bit of tradition that's associated with all of this. For instance, okay, so if you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Matthew and John are identified as being direct followers of Jesus. So Matthew, the tax collector, and there's some debate around all of this for sure, but the baseline of understanding is this: Matthew, being the Matthew tax collector that we find in the Gospels, a follower of Jesus, and then John, the beloved, also listed in the Gospels as disciples. So you had two disciples who are writing their firsthand account of the life of Jesus. So that's important. Then the next two characters, and some of you may not know this, Mark and Luke were not followers of Jesus, at least in his earthly ministry. They most likely came after the resurrection of Jesus. So they were not listed as disciples. They were not followers of Jesus during his earthly ministry that we know of. I mean, there were hundreds of people that were disciples of Jesus that we don't know their names. So maybe they could have been, but traditionally they're not known to have been. So you have two that were direct followers and eyewitnesses, and two who were not. So what about these guys that were not? Why are they writing stories of Jesus? Well, there's some good record to this. Let's look at Mark. Mark, and I'll go simply on this. If you want to learn more about how the Gospel of Mark got here, go see my Mark video on the Gospel. I'll link to it in the show notes. But essentially, Mark is the testimony of Peter. Mark was an apprentice to Peter, and when Mark traveled with Peter, Peter would tell the stories to Mark. Mark wrote it down, shared the tradition. So when you're reading Mark's Gospel, you're essentially reading the Gospel of Peter, essentially, right? You're reading Peter's testimony to Mark of what happened, and that's why you can have a record in Mark. Luke is different though. Luke actually tells us why he's writing what he's writing, and Luke tells us to whom he's writing to, and he tells us how he went about getting the information that he got to write the story that he got. All right, and this is found in Luke chapter 1. We're going to go ahead and turn there and read it for ourselves. So if you have your Bibles, open them up, find Luke, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and go to chapter 1. And once I flip there, I will get there myself. This is the preface to the Gospel according to Luke. This is what Luke says. Now many have undertaken to compile account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, like the accounts passed on to us by those who were eyewitnesses and servants of the word from the beginning. So it seemed good to me as well, because I have followed all things carefully from the beginning, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know for certain the things you were taught. Okay, a couple things that you can pull out. If you're reading slowly, you're paying attention. He makes some observations. So he says, I have followed everything from the beginning. So assuming that Luke is hearing these stories of this Jesus movement, he begins to I'm going to investigate. I'm going to look into it. Okay. He decides for himself to write an orderly account, which means that he is actually working to do good history here. He wants to provide good history for what purpose? For his friend Theophilus, so that his friend Theophilus may actually have confidence in the things that he believes. So Luke, right out of the gate, tells us exactly. He's examining eyewitnesses. He's talking to people that were at boots on the ground. He's compiling this stuff in an orderly way so that he can record the events of Jesus for his friend Theophilus. All right. So Luke tells us exactly why he's writing. So this is what we have here. We have Matthew, follower of Jesus. We have Mark, eyewitness of Peter. We have Luke, talked to all the witnesses, and we had John, follower of Jesus. These are very credible stories about this person, Jesus. Now, before you get into okay, so they're all credible, why are they all so different? Now, that's a great question. Why are these Gospels so different? Most scholars categorize the Gospels into two groups, right? So you have one that's called the Synoptic Gospels, which include 3 of the Gospels, and then you have the Johannine text, which is basically John. So you have Synoptics and John. The Synoptics are grouped together, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, for a purpose, for a reason, and John is on its own. Here's what we know about Matthew, Mark, and Luke. These are called synoptics because they share similar organization, stories, wording, language, that sort of stuff. There's a couple things to note here. In more modern history, in scholarship, Mark is considered to be the first biography written. And here's why. Because Mark contains what's called a very broken Koine Greek. So Koine Greek is Greek, but in the common language Greek, like street level Greek, right? Versus highbrow. If you're in a upper echelons of society, you might speak a higher level of Greek, or we might speak a higher, more I don't know, more educated language in a room full of professors than we would just walking down the street with our friend, right? That kind of thing, right? Common Greek is what all of the Gospels are written in Koine Greek. However, Mark's is actually a step below that. And so what happens is that you have in Mark and Luke what you have is in Matthew and Luke, the same story that they find in Mark. And yet Mark's language, the way he writes it, is such a broken way of speaking that you actually find that Matthew and Luke, in retelling the story, correct the bad grammar in Mark. Same story, but they elevate the language because they can see that what was written down in Mark was actually not very good Greek. And so they correct it in their stories, which tells theologians it looked like Matthew and Luke knew of Mark, because the same story's in there, but they're correcting it. Here's the other, because it's very unlikely that Mark writes from Matthew the same story, but then makes it more broken. He would have copied it exactly as it was. He wouldn't have downgraded the language. He would have upgraded it or kept it the same. But he doesn't. That's not what's in the manuscript evidence. The other thing is this. Luke shares about 50% of the outline found in Mark. So the outline of the narrative is about 50% the same in Mark and Luke, whereas in Mark and Matthew, it's about 90% the same. So theologians look at the manuscript evidence and they go, clearly, Mark was circulating before Matthew and Luke Luke knew of Mark, and they used Mark as the template to write out their gospels. But then it even gets more strange in that there's stuff that they share the same with Mark, and yet there's stuff that they share, Matthew and Luke share together, that is not in Mark. And this is where theologians have no clue what's going on. How is it that two different people writing at two different times can share the exact same material? And when I say the exact same, they're not just telling the same story. They're telling it in the same syntax, sentence structure, language, words, all the things. It's the same. They're clearly copying from something, but what are they copying from? What source are they pulling from? Well, because they don't know what that source is, because it's clearly not Mark, they call it Q, which is the German word Quelle, which means source. They don't know. It's this unknown source that exists called Q. Fascinating research. You should look into it. So there's that, right? So Matthew and Luke share from Mark, right? But then they have material that's not Mark that's there, but then they also have material that only Matthew talks about and only Luke talks about. And so they're clearly adding their own information. This is how all of this is compiled. And it's like so fascinating, maybe to me. Maybe you fast forwarded past this, and I'm sorry if you have, but what that tells us is that there was human intention, divinely inspired, divinely led, but human involvement. A human being was looking at Mark's going, oh yeah, that's good. I'm going to use that for my outline. But he's like, but I like this story too from this source, so I'm going to put that in there. And also I remember Paul or Peter telling me this sort of thing, so I'm going to write that down in there too. And here's my biography. Okay. So that's how they were structured and formed. But then you have the question, why? Why? Okay, so we know that there was a need for written tradition. We know that there are different sources that they're pulling from to make it, but why the differences in the story? Why not just make them all the same? Okay. The other point to make here and why they're not all the same is that they're all trying to reach a different audience. They're all trying to help a specific group of people understand Jesus through the lens that they're living. So in the New Testament and its world, this is what N.T. Wright and Mike Bird classifies each gospel. He says it like this. Matthew takes us into the synagogue where the people of God are learning to recognize Jesus as their king, their Emmanuel. So Matthew's writing to a very Jewish audience. He's trying to help them see how Jesus is actually the promised king, the Davidic line that has come. He is the God with us. He is the Emmanuel that has come to point them the way, much like Moses was leading them out of Egypt and into the promised land. Jesus is the new Moses. And so this is what he's launching them into. Whereas Mark writes a short tract. It's a very short gospel, challenging his readers with the very idea of a crucified king and turning it into a handbook on discipleship for followers of the servant king. So Mark is writing a very short tract. It's like this highlight reel of, hey, this crucified guy is your king. And this is what it looks like to follow him, to serve him, and to be a disciple of him. And so this is what Mark's doing. He's writing quick sound bites of these different events of Jesus's life to get you to see that he is in fact the king, and he is deserves your allegiance and following as a disciple. Luke, on the other hand, addresses the educated Greek world of his day and paints a big picture of God's purposes through Israel's Messiah for the whole world. So whereas Jesus is the Messiah, the long-promised messianic king for the Jews, Mark is trying to get you to see that this crucified king is worth following. Luke is painting a cosmic picture of some sorts to say like he's the king for everyone. So Luke features like so much more women and so much more outcast, and he's doing much more painting a picture that this is for everyone, not just for specific people, and which leads perfectly into his second writing called Acts, where you do see that this message of Jesus is reaching the entire world. John, the final one, by contrast, takes us up the mountain and says quietly, "Look, from here on a clear day you can see forever. We behold the glory of the Father's only Son." So John is doing something very unique in that he's trying to get us to see the nature of this Jesus, of who he is. He is the glory of God. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. It's this whole entry at the beginning of John's gospel that reads so poetically and beautifully. He's trying to get you to see the divinity of Jesus, and all of these work together, which is interesting because the synoptics have their own little thing that they're doing, but 90% of John's gospel is unique to John, which means he doesn't share only 10% of what he shares is found in the synoptic gospels. It's as if John's doing something so different. He's trying to get you to see Jesus from such a different angle than the rest of them. John's gospel was known to be written much later, and so it could simply have been that John knew that Matthew, Mark, Luke existed. And so when John begins to write out his account, he's beginning to share stuff that he thought people needed to know about Jesus that maybe had been debated at the time, kind of these Christological debates that were emerging after the turn of the century, where he's beginning to hear rumblings about this. And so he's trying to combat some of those with his biography writing, whatever, and there's lots of theories as to what's going on there, but generally speaking, these are the themes that are coming out of each one of them. And so what you get out of all of these four is not sameness. And you should not look for sameness. There have been theologians in the 2nd, 3rd century that tried to harmonize all of them, tried to, like, we got to make them all fit. Don't. That's not the point. These are 4 unique portraits of Jesus that all offer us a unique view and perspective on Jesus that are all helpful in us learning about who this Jesus is. So the point isn't to harmonize everything. The point is to let them speak for themselves and let that inform us in how we actually see, imagine, and think about Jesus. All of them form a complete picture through their independent sources. And so here's my encouragement to you when reading the Gospels. Take it all in. Take it all in the sense of what does this show me and reveal to me about the person of Jesus, but also spend time individually. Spend time seeing how Matthew paints this picture. Don't expect Matthew to look like Mark or Luke or John, okay? Don't go, well, that's not the point. Let Matthew speak for himself. Let Mark speak for himself. Let Luke speak for himself. Let John speak for himself. And when they have all spoken collectively, they tell a testimony about a guy named Jesus who lived, who served, who did miraculous miracles and taught people miraculous things. He was killed, suffered horribly, but then after his burial, 3 days later, he resurrected, vindicating the things that he did on this earth, making them true, and then invites all of us to participate in this new work that he's doing called the kingdom of God. This is this person, Jesus. He is worth your time. He is worth learning about, and the best way to learn about Jesus is through these Gospels. So I want to encourage you in future videos, we'll do isolated tracks on each of them, I'm sure. If there's a topic or a conversation you think would be fun to talk about that I didn't get into that you'd like to see a future video in, leave them in the comments. I'll be there watching. And if there's something there that you'd like me to address, I'd love to make a video about it. And so feel free to jump into the community, like, subscribe. If you found this video helpful, share it with a friend. Let people know about the channel. All of the love is important, and even sometimes the questions, maybe not the hate. If you got a lot of hate, save it for yourself or another other a place, but nonetheless, not afraid of it. Bring your questions. This is a safe place to ask all the questions. So thank you for joining us, Whiskey in the Writings. I appreciate you being here. And until next time, cheers.